So hello everyone and welcome back to the Neurocalm Fatigue Summit, and today I have with me Dan Neuffer, who will be known to many of you, I suspect. Dan's story with chronic fatigue syndrome, MECFS and fibromyalgia began with an abrupt onset triggered by vaccination. So his symptoms range from extreme fatigue not alleviated by rest, bouts of fever and other flu-like symptoms, gastrointestinal symptoms, night sweats, cardiac symptoms, orthostatic hypertension, allodynia, excessive urination at night, salt cravings, pain, and neurological symptoms such as fibrofog. And I know a lot of us have been there too. And after fruitlessly seeing dozens of doctors, Dan took matters into his own hands and found a pathway to recovery. And he believes that the autonomic nervous system and its dysregulation plays a fundamental role in these illnesses, and that a comprehensive treatment approach is critical. And when he found the right treatment protocols, treatments that hadn't worked for him before began to work. Since he's recovered, he's written 2 books, CFS Unraveled and Discover Hope. And Dan has created an online recovery program for MECFS and fibromyalgia called ANS Rewire. So welcome, Dan. It's absolutely fantastic to have you here.
It's lovely to speak with you, Anna, and thank you for the intro.
Oh, it's great to have you. And Dan, would you mind to just tell the audience a little bit about your story before we get into some of the meatier stuff that we want to talk about?
Well, yeah, look, I'll summarize it. My story is probably like most people listening. Get sick. At the time, I didn't actually think anything about the vaccination because I just didn't think that would be a problem. It was only in hindsight that I realized it was triggered by that. Even though it should have been obvious, but it wasn't just really the vaccination. It's like just about everyone you speak to, it's actually a number of things that happen at the same time that triggered my illness. And yeah, like everyone, you go around from doctor to doctor. Initially, they said, "Oh, you have some sort of virus, and maybe we don't know what it is, but it'll go away." And that's kind of probably what I stuck with in my mind. And yeah, days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into years. Weird, unexplained fevers and virus-like illness turns into CFS, which I basically denied. I had a real illness. I thought CFS, that sounds like fatigue. No, I've got like fevers and all kinds of weird stuff going on, And I'm a bit ignorant, like most of people, I suppose. And the name doesn't help, does it? And I'm losing my earpiece here, so excuse me. And then after some years, I started to get then the pain came on. Here and there, I always had pain from the beginning when I had flare-ups, but then I started to get persistent pain, typical fibromyalgia pain. I also had periods of POTS, and I had some inklings of multiple chemical sensitivities, but then not really, but sort of started to, I always thought of it as one illness, and I still do. I would say that all of these illnesses have the same cause, as in the same mechanism that causes them. So the same underlying dysfunction. It's my very strong view that ME, CFS, POTS, multiple chemical sensitivities, fibromyalgia are all a dysfunction of the brain.
Right.
Now, I talk about it being a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. That's probably a little bit simplistic. If you really look at what's going on in the brain, especially when it comes to pain, it gets very complex. Many areas of the brain are involved. But the question is, well, why is it happening? And I think, when I wrote my book, when I first came up with the hypothesis, it was a bit uncomfortable, I suppose, coming up with this, and it seemed to make sense to me. Everything pointed to this. It seemed obvious, right? It explained all how different people get ill. It explained all the symptoms. And then obviously after I got well and learned other people recovered, which I didn't realize whilst I was ill, it also explains how people get well in all these different ways. So it explains everything. But now really we have an overwhelming level of evidence how autonomic dysfunction drives fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is, I suppose, perhaps more researched. It is considered often more as a real illness. Many of us without the pain sort of don't get taken serious until we get the pain, and then suddenly it's like we have a real illness, and it's like, I've already been suffering for 3-4 years. This is just an extra symptom, right? And of course, POTS is always been medically recognized as being dysautonomia, autonomic nervous system dysfunction. So that one is not an issue. When you start looking at the sensitivities like multiple chemical sensitivities and electromagnetic hypersensitivity, then people are talking more about sensitization, and like as we are in fibromyalgia. But really, I would suggest there's a similar thing going on with symptoms of fatigue and other symptoms in CFS. So the more experience I have, the more I learn about this illness, this group of illnesses, if you want to call it that, the less difference I think there is, not the more.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the further you go, the fundamental picture leads in the same direction, no matter what evidence you're examining. So
well, and that's what led me to that conclusion in the first place, is that all, that's like saying all roads lead to Rome, and here all roads more or less, led us to the autonomic nervous system. What complicates the picture is that the dysfunction in POTS can be easily measured. When you look at CFS and fibromyalgia, it's not broken. And broken can be easily measured. If someone's got Cushing's disease, if someone's got, an illness like this, you can measure it very, very easily. And Addison's disease or whatever, right? But here we got it dysfunctioning, and it's dysfunctioning different this week than last week, and it's dysfunctioning different today than it was yesterday.
Yeah.
And it'll dysfunction different between Harry and John and Sally, and it'll all be different on all of them in maybe a year or two. So this is complicated, right?
Absolutely.
And
it makes it a difficult experience for the sufferer to have this constant shifting of.
Yes.
It's very hard then, I think, to be able to say to people anything about your illness that doesn't sound crazy, right?
Absolutely, and it also makes it difficult for the physicians. Like, I mean, it's maddening. Someone keeps coming up with symptoms that you cannot explain, and you do tests, and obviously not the right tests, but the tests you are doing, it doesn't explain what's going on. And if it does show something is wrong, it doesn't explain all the symptoms. And so it is a little bit maddening. And unfortunately, I think because of that, the illness has often been sort of put into too hard basket, or it has been sort of misconstrued as being a mental illness or something like this, or being depression or anxiety, which is it's pretty offensive. The science has been around a long time. I don't feel the illness is a mystery. Okay, when I talk about the autonomic nervous system theory, then sometimes it's like, oh, this is it, or is this it, or is this new? The evidence has been around a long time. There's a lot of evidence. It's just not a lot of agreement for some reason. But especially if you look in the fibromyalgia side of things, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, as my research friends are telling me, and I'm hoping that will come to be more clear with CFS. That the problem is that when you start talking about something neurological, you start talking about brain. When you start talking about brain, you start talking about brain training. When you start talking about brain training, if you've got a machine to train the brain, or if you've got a physical way to train the brain, then it's more acceptable. But if you start using psychological methods, then it starts to get into the whole narrative of or this is all in your head, or like it's a mental illness.
Yeah.
And because we get dismissed, not believed, I mean, this is kind of a touchy area, and we all get very sensitive about it. And I think it's kind of stopping the research from coming through.
Yeah.
Now, the same issues are with chronic pain. There's a lot of solutions. I've been sending patients to pain psychologists for a decade now. And when they get there, most of the time, the pain psychologists kind of talk to them about managing things. And I'm like, why are you doing that? You're supposed to be helping these people get rid of the pain, So I think we tend to aim too low, and there's still a lack of understanding because the illness is very complex. And that's why I created the program, to give that education, to help people get their head around what is, a little bit of a maddening experience.
Yeah, and that education in itself can be a very calming thing, because when you understand what's happening, you then invoking a sense of agency and a capacity to actually move forward, which is really lacking when you just don't understand what's happening to you, and everyone is implying it's basically some psychological disorder or whatever it is. That in itself really triggers the autonomic nervous system. The stress induced by that is quite phenomenal and very, very counterproductive to any healing journey at all.
Well, so, absolutely.
The education, Dan, what tools do you give people? Like, what do you actually give them practically to do?
So the ANS Rewire program is not about, oh, here's a cure, or here's a solution, do this. Because you've got to recognize that the patient population is heterogeneous, right? And the dysfunctions are, many dysfunctions, and many of these dysfunctions are also triggering of the autonomic nervous system. So I know there are some mind-body approaches which are very singular and focused and say, well, just do this. And they don't talk about physical treatments, right? However, we talk about physical treatments because what you also have is, you don't just have ANS dysfunction. Because we are so ill, we actually get secondary dysfunctions, which kind of get a life of their own. Look, a good example of this is irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. Now, in my view, this is the same illness as fibromyalgia or CFS. It's not a different or a subcategory or an additional thing. It is ANS dysfunction. It is a brain illness, okay? But because all the symptoms are in the gut, and because we can do tests and we can show that you can't tolerate certain foods, you might benefit from a low FODMAP diet, you may have a candida infection, dysbiosis, parasites, and all this stuff is real. You go, well, this is clearly a physical problem. But this separation between a physical problem and a problem of the brain or a dysfunction neurologically, that's where the problem is in medicine and where people are getting lost. Yeah, they're acting, and I'll be honest, like I make the same mistake still. Right. I did an interview with one of the people who recovered in my program, and she pointed out to me, well, it's not like these are separate things. And I'm like, yes, that's right. I kind of forgot for a moment. Right. So they are absolutely connected. Right. And that's why, for instance, with a person with irritable bowel syndrome, the balloon in the bum, you blow it up. Normal person goes, that's weird and uncomfortable. Person with IBS will scream out in pain. So you can call it fibromyalgia of the bowel. So what we do is we need to address our different dysfunctions. We need to understand the physiological triggers. Yes. And there are multitude, right? We also need to understand the neurological triggers, and then we need to address those. Now, physiological triggers, well, the obvious one for people with CFS is physical exercise, but it can be many things. It can be even normal processes in the body. Like when your blood sugar, it varies. The autonomic nervous system is supposed to take care of everything in the body. When things occur, it responds. But what's happening is it doesn't respond correctly. It over-responds or has a hyper reaction. And so therefore, we need to, first of all, reduce the triggering of the brain. And we do that by getting rid of the physical triggering, the neurological triggering, and even psychological triggering, right? And once we bring that arousal down and the level of triggering, we can then get focus, and focus is the key thing in order to affect neuroplasticity. And so we then seek to train the brain to start to behave different. And the interesting thing is, through this process of kindling, which leads to all these problems, ridiculous things, like, some people are like barometers. They'll start getting pain flare-ups because the barometric pressure is changing slightly. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? It's the most ridiculous things that people get triggered by. And this process is called kindling. And it works against us, but we can make it work for us. And so what we find is that by training the brain on certain things, the brain stops then hyper-reacting to other triggers, even though you're not doing any training, okay? Because you can't, for instance, train your brain not to react when your blood sugar goes slightly below suboptimal, which is completely normal. It happens to every person, right? In a cycle of a day or night. Because you don't even know it's happening. How could you train that? You might be asleep. You might have no symptoms, right? So you can't train that. You can't, you don't need to fix everything. What happens is when, just like there's a tipping point that leads people experiencing this illness into the dysfunction, we can get a tipping point that leads us out of the dysfunction.
Yeah. And
we don't need to fix everything. We just need to train the brain to start behaving normally.
Yes.
My background is in science. So whilst I wasn't about just getting rid of symptoms and I want to understand the causal relationship, it was still very much focused on I've got this problem, I'm sick, it's not working, I want it to work and get on with my life. And this is what I did, and I found a way to recover. And when I then started to do interviews with other people who'd recovered, I'd get to the interview and they go, wow, like it's such an amazing thing. I'm kind of glad I had this illness. And I'd be like, where's the mute button? Like they're saying, I can't publish this. This is horrendous. Like this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Everyone else I know thinks it's the worst thing. And these people are saying, I'm glad I had the illness. I was like, that wasn't my experience. Okay. But I speak to so many people who say that all the time. And then I'm like, what's going on? And then the people would say to me, oh, this illness and recovering from this illness, and they did it all different ways, right? Which we can explain through this underlying explanation. And they'd say to me, oh, Dan, it was a spiritual journey. And honestly, at the time, I was probably rolling my eyes so hard, I was on the verge of doing myself an injury, right? But of course, that was very ignorant on my behalf. Very ignorant. And so in this last decade, I have spoken to more people than I can count in terms of who've recovered, and also people who are still ill with this illness. And if you look at how people get ill, and then this is widely understood in medicine. So, obviously when I first wrote Cephas Unraveled, it was like explaining about the stressors and blah, 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 blah. But I think everyone agrees on that now. It's no longer controversial, right? It's just people get funny reactions when they hear the word stressor because they think it's something psychological. But, if you pour boiling water on your hand, even if you're not emotionally distraught, and you will be, it's a stressor. When you get a virus, it's a stressor. When you get a vaccination, it's a stressor. It's designed to stress your nervous system into producing a desired response. When you exercise, it's a stressor, right? And so we know that everybody has a range of stressors, and sometimes one very big stressor or two stressors, and then they get ill, right? And obviously, we're seeing that more recently again with a lot of attention on post-viral fatigue syndrome. And so the question is, though, so what is a stressor? And, we tend to think very shallowly, I think, in the West. So we go, a stressor is the event. We have this idea that the stress has to do with the event, but the stress has to do with how our body responds, and how we respond psychologically and physically. Everyone says, Well, illness, yeah, it's caused by a virus. Well, this is, again, I don't think this is very scientific. Okay, because yes, of course, if you get a viral illness, of course you caught a virus, and of course you became ill with a viral illness due to that viral infection. But it's not the reason why you're sick. Yeah. Like when you get a virus and you get fever, that's not the virus giving you fever. It's your autonomic nervous system. Yes. And that's why you're getting a runny nose. It's the body's response to fight the virus. And how sick does a virus make you? Well, that depends on how healthy your body is right now. Otherwise, everybody would be having the same experience to every viral infection, and everybody would catch every virus. Yes. But, if I go to a barbecue with my friends and someone there's got a cold, then some of us will catch it, some of us won't. So these are important concepts to really start to think about, okay? That is that there's two sides of an equation. And so the point is that there's more going on than just saying, oh, I had a stressor. Yeah. And if you're asking, what is the purpose? Well, the first question I ask people as they're starting to make recovery progress is, is it a good idea for you to recover? And just about fall out of their chair. And obviously, I think it's a good idea for everyone to recover, and everyone I know thinks it's a good idea for them to recover. But I'm not asking really from our point of view. I'm asking from the point of view of the nervous system. Because we all look at this as the illness being the problem. Because for all of us, it is a problem. It's a huge problem, right? But I would pose that from the nervous system point of view, it's not the problem, it's a solution.
Yeah, exactly.
And what we have to do is get rid of the problem. And one of the greatest stressors, and I think it's not spoken about enough, is our lack of social connection.
Yeah.
We have a whole generation of people who don't know how to make friends. They don't have any real friends.
Yeah.
And friendship has a completely different meaning. Yeah. And without, and we don't have a social connection in our communities.
Yeah, and that's huge.
We used to all know each other.
That's really difficult as well for people with fatigue, because it's often intrinsically isolating experience.
It is, and this is why it becomes also maladaptive, because we're talking about resolving stress, not having so much stress. Well, I don't know that anything can be more stressful for anybody that I've known with this illness than when they were ill.
Yes.
And there's your clue of why this illness perpetuates.
Yeah.
Right. However, what you'll often find that is, as people seek to make a recovery, they immediately engage with life and their challenges and their illness in a way that they did before they got ill. And it's often what frustrates their recovery.
Yes.
So as soon as they feel a bit better, they got to clean out the attic. And as soon as they can get out of bed, they're making soup for Mrs. Smith across the road and delivering it 3 times a week. Yeah. Selfish, lazy, self-serving people, I don't see them getting this illness.
It's a very interesting observation.
and it's so hilarious. Sometimes you hear people with these silly comments that people with this illness, they're weak, they're making it up, they're soft, they got to harden up and just push themselves. And I always laugh at this, going, if it was only true, right? If it was only true, I would promise you, if it was even half true, these people probably would never have gotten the illness. So in my experience, people who get this illness tend to be tough. They tend to have high standards. They tend to help other people more than they should, right? And that leads to a life of excessive stress. So I think these questions you're asking are really, really pertinent, Anna. And I think, one last thing I would like to, I guess, say on the subject is we come from a society where we think things should be good. If I asked your great-grandfather that everything should be good and he should definitely know that he will have all the money he needs until the day he dies and they'll be safe, that your great-grandfather would look at you and think, what's wrong with this girl? But if you look at the real world, is that you are presented with challenges. It's always been like that, and it's still like that in most of the world.
What I'm hearing you say is that there's been a loss, a social loss of resilience.
Yes, yes, indeed. A social loss of resilience and a loss of social connection. What is fear?
Yeah.
Like, I've thought about this, and people talk about fear and all this. Well, what is fear? Fear has to do with your belief on how you will cope with an event. It is not the event that is the problem. It is how you think you'll cope with it.
Yeah, although there are some events like, nuclear obliteration is intrinsically terrifying. But I hear what you're saying. And I think it's really important, I guess, for us all to understand that there is a healthy level of stress that can flip into being traumatic and destructive, depending how the receiving system responds to the stressor. Which is what I've
absolutely
been hearing, which gives us
I just think
gives us a huge amount of agency, doesn't it? Because then I guess we can go into strategies of self-calming, evolving our own capacity to be fluid around challenges, to expand our sense of capability, to get our nervous system into a situation where our stress threshold rises so that we can cope with more easily. That gives us enormous agency.
And look, I really like the word of your use of the word fluid. I tend to use the word flexibility, but indeed, we need to be able to change on the rules that we use in order to evaluate the experiences in our lives.
Yeah.
And it's the meaning that we give to things that gets us into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And gets us out of a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And that's a really good note to end on, because the idea there, I think, is very empowering, that we have the capacity to reframe to get ourselves out of trouble. Seems to be a really central message in your work, Dan. I want to thank you very much for this interview, Dan, and for giving up some time to speak to the audience. So everyone, I want to thank Dan on our behalf. Dan, it's been a real pleasure to interview you.
Look, it's been my pleasure, and I really appreciate your deeper reflections and questions regarding these challenges.
Cool. Thank you, Dan.